Why is jazz so f***ing boring to listen to?
Can't pick out any of the notes. That's great, man. That sucks.
Welcome back to the channel, everyone. I know it's been a minute. The last few months of 2024 got a little hectic for me. I was out on the road touring, juggling a bunch of projects that all sprang up, and honestly, I'm just now getting back into the groove of making videos again on a regular basis. So I apologize for that. But anyway, let's get into the video. So why do I ask, why is jazz so boring to listen to? Well, partly because I needed a hook for the first 5 seconds of this video, but more so because I want to explore the reasons why it seems like people have such polarizing opinions when it comes to jazz. I think one of the most commonly voiced opinions is that it all just kind of sounds wrong and just bad. And then opponents of this idea will say, well, that's just because you don't have the refined set of ears to appreciate genuinely good music. You'll hear people say it's so uninspiring to listen to and it makes me want to just zone out and fall asleep. And then other people say that there's nothing that can compare to the excitement and the stimulation of jazz.
Very, very exciting.
So why does this happen? Well, for starters, I think there's a lot of people out there, and musicians in particular, who do no favors to reduce the stigma surrounding the genre of jazz. And I think it's this type of elitist attitude that really turns a lot of people off from further exploring jazz. I mean, we've all felt that feeling before of being talked down to, like we have no business voicing our own opinions about a particular subject, because there's some obnoxious asshole ruining what otherwise might be a really insightful and exciting conversation. And that's not fun for anyone. At the same time, I think there's plenty of people who are overly critical of things that they might not be personally drawn to or fully understand, and music is certainly no exception to that. And instead of taking the opportunity to learn more about that particular thing, they choose the easier option of cherry-picking certain points to support a preconceived notion. And it's honestly a shame, because I think that when approached with an open mind and free from the anxiety of feeling talked down to, jazz is perhaps the most honest, inviting, and liberating form of art. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's take a step back and have a brief history lesson so we can understand a little better what we're talking about. The history of jazz ultimately has its origins in the rhythms and musical traditions of West Africa. And while those roots go back centuries, it wasn't until the early 20th century that jazz really started to take shape as a distinct commercialized genre, and eventually a cornerstone of American culture that would go on to influence virtually every genre of music we know today. Developing out of black communities in New Orleans, jazz attained its unique sound by combining styles of African, Caribbean, and European music performed on instruments originating from Western culture. And it was that melting pot of cultural influences that gave jazz its unique sound, unlike anything anyone had ever heard before. It was in 1912 in an LA Times article about baseball that we find the earliest known use of the term jazz. And while there's debate about where exactly the word jazz is derived from, it's clear that in this particular context it's being used to mean lively, energetic, and unpredictable. Jazz in its early form was heavily influenced by the genre of ragtime, made popular by figures like Scott Joplin, as well as the music of W.C. Handy, who's generally credited with propelling the music of the blues from a largely underground rural tradition into the mainstream spotlight. During the 1920s, jazz exploded in popularity. Cities like Chicago and New York became centers for jazz, and the new genre gave rise to the prominence of big band and swing music, as well as jazz icons like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, who would go on to define the genre. During the 1930s, singers such as Billie Holiday were putting their own spin on popular songs written for Broadway musicals and Hollywood films. As time would go on, these recordings would form the pillars of what we call the Great American Songbook. These collections of songs would serve as the new template for which jazz musicians would reinvent, rearrange, and improvise over to create new material. By the 1940s, jazz was considered the dominant form of music, but musicians in particular were seeking something new, a more fast-paced, complex, and experimental form of jazz that would come to be known as the bebop era. Pioneered by figures like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, this form of jazz was characterized by smaller ensembles with a much larger focus on collective improvisation. The 1950s introduced us to the genre of cool jazz, which emerged as a reaction to bebop. While still utilizing smaller ensembles, this new subgenre of jazz focused on slower tempos, expressive melodies, and even incorporated certain elements of classical music. By the way, if you're interested in checking out an extremely unique album that does an amazing job of blending classical Spanish music and jazz, check out Sketches of Spain by Miles Davis. Speaking of Miles Davis, it was around the mid to late 1950s that Miles Davis in particular would pioneer the newest subgenre of jazz called modal jazz, which centered around the use of improvising over musical modes as opposed to fast-changing chord progressions. This new approach ultimately led to the creation of what is considered by many critics to be the greatest jazz album of all time, Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. Even if the term musical modes means nothing to you, you can kind of think about them as types of scales, and it's more than anything something you can feel when comparing tracks like So What to recordings from the bebop era. The 1960s saw the evolution of jazz being pushed to the limits by musicians such as Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane. Free jazz rejected the traditional structures and harmony, allowing room for a more avant-garde and unrestrained sound. Rock, funk, and pop music of the day would find their way into the jazz scene, formulating the next and very aptly titled subgenre, fusion. This style was characterized by a strong emphasis on the use of electronic instruments, keeping up with the rapidly advancing technology at the time. And since then, jazz has expanded into all kinds of different genres. Artists like Esperanza Spalding, Robert Glasper, Victor Wooten, and Nate Smith have all contributed towards bringing jazz into the modern spotlight, while also continuing to develop and push the genre further. But wait, we still haven't talked about why it seems people hate jazz.
I hate jazz.
Well, I'm not gonna pretend to have the answer, because I don't think that there is a singular objective answer to this question, but I do want to offer my own personal thoughts. So let's start here. Now that we've talked a little bit about where jazz comes from, we can establish that jazz, at the core of it, is about improvisation. It's an ongoing, dynamic conversation, constantly shifting, evolving, and reacting in real time. Even though all these various subgenres might sound very different on the surface, they all share the same underlying approach to making music. And yeah, it's easy to say that, well, because jazz is improvised, it doesn't sound structured enough for some people. Fair enough, but I want to try digging a little deeper than that. And it starts with establishing a premise, which is that I think jazz inherently has a very egocentric quality to it. And I don't mean that in a bad way. What I mean is that jazz is possibly the first genre to prioritize above all else the performer. To put this in context, before the 20th century, the musical landscape was largely dominated, at least in Western cultures, by composers rather than performers. And the reason for that was largely due to the lack of recording technology at the time. When composers had new ideas, they couldn't simply record them, they had to notate them on paper. And for the average listener to experience music, the only option aside from learning to read and perform music yourself was to attend live performance. In a way, concert halls were like the original streaming platforms, because just like today, the artists received absolutely nothing for their music being played. In contrast to composers, the performer's role was to essentially interpret the music as accurately and truly as possible. In other words, the performer was there to act as a medium through which the composer's ideas could be brought to life. For the audience/listener, they would essentially be viewing them as sort of a playback device. Now, I want to make this clear that this is a bit of a generalization, and there's always been considerable debate amongst the classical community about how much personal interpretation should be allowed in a particular piece of music. Just want to address that so I don't stir up the classical community too much, although I might have already done that, but that's okay. In comparison, the spontaneous nature of jazz paired with the advent of recording technology ultimately transformed the activity of live performance. Suddenly, the performance itself became a work of art. The role of the individual performer was reshaped, and their ability to showcase their own musical interpretation was the central focus. So, if you were to sum it up, you might say that for the performer, jazz is all about you, while classical is all about someone else. Yeah, I might have ignited a firestorm with that one. Anyway, why is this comparison relevant? Well, because I think that it illustrates a similar effect which is happening today. With the advent of recording technology in the 20th century, music wasn't just seen as an art form anymore, it also became an industry. Columbia, RCA, Capitol, Motown, Atlantic are all early examples of record labels that played a massive role in changing not just how music was distributed and consumed, but how it influenced the culture at large. And as a side note, this is not an attempt to bash contemporary music genres. In fact, I would say that music of the last 50 years is overwhelmingly the biggest source of my own inspiration. I love contemporary and modern music, but the rise of the music industry created a major shift, one that I think is really important to acknowledge. As music became a serious business, a means of generating huge profit, it also created a new incentive, and that incentive increasingly centered around one question: is the listener being entertained? It's really the answer to that question that will determine whether a song or an album is being distributed, shared, streamed, and marketed. And again, I don't mean for this to come across as overly cynical, because at the end of the day, who doesn't like being entertained? I think every one of us falls into that boat. Am I claiming that prior to the development of the music industry, people were not being entertained and were choosing to listen to music purely for the sake of being a monocle-wearing connoisseur of fine art? No, of course not. I'm saying that as time has gone on, we have increasingly shifted towards placing consumerism at the top of our priorities when it comes to music being made in the first place.
It goes on forever, 6 bloody minutes.
The question has become increasingly less about what the artist wants to express and more about how it will be received. So to amend my prior statement, I think one could argue that the aesthetic of classical music is born from the composer, the art of jazz is born from the performer, and the industry of music is born from the listener. I think this way of thinking highlights something really important. Music doesn't just exist as a genre. It exists as a relationship between multiple entities, creators, performers, and audiences. And when it comes to listening to jazz, I think this is where the disconnect happens. Because of the fact that today we're more accustomed to hearing music that has a stronger focus on the listener, we naturally internalize modern forms of music as being more approachable, because they were largely created with us, the listener, in mind. So consequently, when one tries to listen to jazz through that same lens of a consumer waiting to be acknowledged, I think it naturally creates a sense of apprehension, uncertainty, and may ultimately make the listener feel disconnected. Jazz is certainly not concerned with pleasing the audience first. It's all about an artist and an individual performer expressing something in the moment. I think when approached this way, listening to jazz becomes less about what is this giving me and more about what am I witnessing. Now, for some people, finding jazz enjoyable comes really naturally, but I think it's oftentimes a result of recognizing the entity for which jazz prioritizes. So next time you hear or get to see live jazz, I would say try approaching the listening process with the mindset of, I'm gonna watch someone else have a conversation. I think it's about shifting that bodily perspective from that of a consumer to that of an individual performer that really makes the difference. Oh god, this video is already too long. So let's wrap up with something a little more practical. So what should you listen to if you're starting out trying to get more into jazz and you want to be able to kind of grasp what the hell's going on? Well, I always recommend Cookin' with the Miles Davis Quintet by the Miles Davis Quintet. I think it's a solid entry point, especially if you're feeling unsure about what exactly to listen for. Like I mentioned before, so much of the foundational structure of jazz comes from reinterpreting old familiar tunes. So the good news is that if you look at the track listing for a lot of these classic jazz albums, chances are you're gonna recognize a lot of these song titles. Songs like My Favorite Things, Fly Me to the Moon, Someday My Prince Will Come, Stella by Starlight, The Girl from Ipanema. In a general sense, most of these recordings follow a similar structure of the melody being played first, which is referred to as the head, followed by several or all of the band members taking a solo over the same exact chord progressions, and ending by returning to the head one final time. So if you happen to get lost in all of the different solos happening, just try humming the melody to yourself. That can help you stay oriented and follow along with the structure. If you're interested in hearing great jazz vocalists, you can check out the album Ella and Louie by Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, accompanied by icons like Oscar Peterson, Ray Brown, and Buddy Rich. This is a beautiful album.
Oh, suddenly I saw you there, and through foggy London town, the sun was...
If you're wanting something with a bit more of a modern sound to it, you can check out the legendary fusion record Heavy Weather by Weather Report, as well as one of my personal favorites, the Live in Japan album, that is also a rhythmic feast, Herbie Hancock's Flood. If you're interested in one of the most groundbreaking avant-garde records, you can check out Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come. As well as Alice Coltrane's transcendent Journey in Satchidananda. And one last tip that I always recommend is to read about what you're listening to. For me at least, even skimming the Wikipedia page can totally change the listening experience, and I feel like it allows me to appreciate so much more about where the music is coming from. In all honesty, there have been plenty of albums that I did not care for initially, and then after reading about them and having more context, some of those became my favorite albums of all time. So yeah, reading. And on that note, if you stuck around to the end, thank you so much. I hope this lengthy analysis was somewhat informative. And if you happen to be someone who's always been weary about listening to jazz, I hope that this has at least given you a starting point for approaching the madness that is jazz. Let me know your thoughts in the comment, everyone. I'd love to hear from you. That's gonna do it for this one, y'all. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.